Cool. And then you guys see that all right?
You bet.
Cool. Perfect. Yeah, so good afternoon, everybody. My name's Sam, and I did my applied thesis on the implementation of remote work in supply chains. So a little bit about what's on the menu for today. We've got, I'm going to talk a little bit about remote work, and then specifically for the supply chain field. And then I'm going to get into the actual the thing that happened at my internship at Stella Farms, the applied portion of the thesis. Then I'm going to touch on popular remote work applications and what works for what scenarios. I'm going to get into some professional opinions. So I got to interview a bunch of different people in the supply chain field. And then we'll touch on a few insights into the future and what I think will possibly be the reality in the decades to come. Yeah. So first things first, I'm going to hit you guys with a real big number here. And I'll just tell you what it is because it's going to take my dad a while to count it on his fingers. But that's 1.6 trillion right there. And that's the United States' business logistics costs in 2018 alone. And that represents about 8% of US GDP. And to put that in perspective, logistics is just one aspect of supply chain. My internship dealt with logistics, but there's also procurement, supplier relationships, inventory management. It's really everything about getting the product from your supplier to the customer in a quick, safe, and cost-effective manner, right? So we can see how important supply chains are to the U.S. economy. Now, let me get into a little about remote work and the supply chain. So in the early 1990s, we had the advent of the internet. People started to begin to use and buy computers, and we had IBM and AT&T allow employees to work from home and telecommute. And now this obviously wasn't a great thing because you're tethered down to a specific location. But in the early 2000s, that actually wasn't the case either. We were able to move away from being plugged into a specific wire, and we could take our work wherever, right? And so we saw slow increases in remote work. And then in 2018, we have 4.3 million Americans working from home at least half the time. And this is, 2018 labor statistics. There's about, 150, 155 million people that are employed. So while it's not the majority by any means, it's still a sizable percentage, right? And then 2 years later, we have this big shift. We all experienced it. COVID-19 happened, blah, blah, blah. We've talked about it enough. So from February to May 2020, a third of the labor force switched to remote work. And now we have almost half of American workers working from home. And this kind of says that, if you can work from home, they probably were at that time. Now, this number has obviously decreased a little bit, but as I will talk about later, plenty of supply chain roles can still be done from a remote in a remote manner. And what did this mean for the supply chain? Well, supply chains are very real time, especially in logistics. We're constantly dealing with problems that come up. So meetings and communication can be held using different apps like Zoom or Slack or Microsoft Teams. Data analysis and collaboration can be done with Excel. And anecdotally, I spent a year in a completely remote learning environment. This is a complicated task. I'm taking some of the hardest classes I've ever taken. And ultimately, I was able to be successful. I completed a bunch of different projects, and I also did a case competition remotely. So there's no doubt that really complicated tasks can be completed in a remote environment. So specifically about my internship, I began my internship in mid-May, and we did in person for a little while. My job at Stella Farms was essentially what we were doing was we were shipping watermelons in refrigerated containers on the back of trucks, and we call them reefers. And these essentially we were taking watermelons and just shipping them all across the country to different DCs, and then from those DCs they go to the store. Then from the store, you buy them and you eat them, obviously. So in June, we actually had to go completely remote when one of my coworkers contracted COVID-19. Now, in the logistics industry, we're constantly dealing with real-time issues. A driver didn't show up to the DC, or he didn't show up to the farm, or the reefer broke, or he showed up, but all the melons are smashed, and it looks like Wreck-It Ralph got back there. So we constantly have to deal with these problems. And we needed a platform that would allow us to continue to communicate and work together. So I immediately that day when we went remote, I shifted us onto Microsoft Teams. And throughout the rest of the semester, there was a bit of a learning curve, but we spent the next, 6 to 8 weeks just completely working remotely, and it ended up working out all right. So I want to touch on a few of the different applications I looked at when I was deciding that day of what would work for us. So obviously we've all heard of Zoom. It's great for video conferencing and meetings. They have hundreds of millions of daily active participants. You can share your screen, you can chat, you can draw while you present, which is always fun and distracting. But um, and also Zoom Basic is free, so that was a big plus. It doesn't have all the features and the functionality. You have limited users and limited time for the meetings, but there is a free aspect to there. Now Microsoft Teams, which ended up being the application that I chose, launched in March of 2017, so a few years ago, and by the end of 2020, they have over 100 million daily active users, and this has obviously been boosted well because of the pandemic. And Microsoft Teams acts as a central hub for video calls, voice calls, and messaging, and it really facilitates participation from a variety of different people on a project. You can share files, and it allows you to organize work into different channels. And I can talk about why in a second, why that was what we needed at Stella Farms. Lastly, there's Slack, another thing that probably most of you are familiar with. Slack was something that I was acquainted with at ASU. A lot of it was using to chat with different professors and fellow students in classes. And so it's predominantly known for its messaging capabilities, but it can have, you can integrate a video software into Slack and use it almost like Microsoft Teams would be used. Now, was there a best option? No, the best option for Stella Farms, it turned out it was Microsoft Teams. But for every business logistics case, it could be a variety of different options, and it really depends on the situation. Microsoft Teams worked great for us at Stella Farms because we were able to segment up our work, talk in real time, and we could implant the documents we were working on right in Microsoft Teams. So it was the best for us, but it's certainly not the best for everybody. However, the one constant I do find is that time is always of the essence. Optimal implementation of remote work requires quick action, especially in the supply chain field. You can't be down for a day, you can't be down for a week deciding which software to use. It's incredibly important that you make the transition really, really quickly. And that's something that I learned over the summer. There's really, there's nothing better. There's nothing more that can be done than making that transition as quickly as possible, because time is the greatest asset there. So now I want to get into the professional opinion. So I talked to people from Amazon, ASU, Intel, and PepsiCo. And I talked with them about the last year and a half, and how they transitioned into remote work and how they're dealing with it now. So firstly, I believe that there was generally a positive sentiment towards remote work. I think a lot of people were surprised at how well it actually ended up working. First, I spoke with Jed Parkinson at Intel. He's been working at Intel for 24 years, so he has vast experience managing products and people. He noted that availability is really key to success when you're working remotely. You want to have that same type of ability to have conversations with people, walk over to their desk and talk to them. This is the same thing we want to have in a remote environment. He noted that people were working a little bit later, so while they were able to cut down on their commutes, they could actually add that to time that they were being productive. And he estimated that about a third of supply chain roles for that he managed could actually be done remotely. And we'll talk about the benefits of that in the next slide. Kaylin Crotes is a professor at ASU, and she was very comfortable with conducting meetings remotely. She's technologically savvy and has no problem with dealing with Zoom. However, she did feel there were some drawbacks. Being on Zoom all day can be really fatiguing, and she felt like a hybrid approach may be what she would enjoy the best moving forward, giving her a chance to have those in-person conversations, but also the ability to work from home when she wanted to. I spoke with Jared from Amazon, And he kind of had something similar as what I was saying earlier about completing a complicated task. He was able to onboard multiple new hires entirely remotely. And it goes to show the power of remote work when you're bringing someone on who knows nothing and you want to make them a valuable contributor to, a complicated company like Amazon. It goes to show the power that remote work actually has. Lastly, I spoke with two young professionals at PepsiCo. They're both entering the supply chain program for PepsiCo a couple years out of college. They felt that working remotely kind of reduced their ability to have interactions with their new coworkers and really network a little bit better and feel out people's personalities. They found that I found that a hybrid approach maybe was the best for them. And they also, but they noted that the lack of commute time was nice, and that it saved them money on gas, and they were able to add some productivity to the ends of their days. Lastly, I want to talk about some considerations and some future ideas that stemmed from this thesis. So first things first, I want to cover something about the autonomy paradox. I mentioned this earlier, but I didn't talk about it in name. And this is actually this idea where people are suddenly allowed to work remotely. They feel like they have all this autonomy because they can go wherever they want and do their work. But in reality, what has happened is that the office now becomes wherever they are, which isn't all that autonomous, and it's not all that nice, because maybe now you're spending time, instead you should be spending time with your family, but you're just texting or you're emailing a coworker at the dinner table when you should be eating dinner. So what used to be segmented times in your life for work and family and friends now become kind of blurred, and this can be a problem for a lot of people. Secondly, there's an increased pool of possible candidates, especially for supply chain roles. So Jed noted that for people working in supply chain roles, for him, about a third of them can be doing remote. And now what this does for Jed is it allows Jed to increase his the hiring pool dramatically, because he's not just hiring people that can show up to the office in Tempe. He can hire people from wherever in the United States. So now he has more leverage. He can find the best candidate, and ultimately, he is just going to try and find the overachievers, right? And now that kind of feeds me into my next point. Overachievers are going to stand out in this environment. There's no room to hide. There's no room to just be a face, to just socially interact with people. What you do really stands out. And if you're productive and efficient, that and going above and beyond is really highlighted by a remote environment. Some technology I want to highlight is virtual reality. So Facebook definitely entering this space with the Oculus technology, and in terms of augmented reality, Microsoft just signed a big contract with the U.S. Army. Slightly different technology, but what virtual reality could offer is an aid to what Kaylin Crowitz had a problem with. She's sick of Zoom. She wants some of that in-person communication. Well, we can do that in virtual reality. Allowing people to meet similar to if they were in person, once the technology gets a little bit better. And we can avoid a lot of those costs. So I'm not spending $2,000 on a plane ticket to London to go have a conversation with my supplier. I can now just put on a headset and we can have that conversation. And it's very similar to being in person. And lastly, again, the hybrid model, it just seems like a lot of professionals kept talking about that. They felt like the ability to work in the office and also have that ability to work from home was really awesome. And it gave them the flexibility they needed to be the most productive. So that's it for me. If anybody has any questions, let's do it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. I'm intrigued. I mean, you talked about the hybrid model a little bit. Have you kept in touch with your internship? What are they doing? Are they looking at a hybrid model, or are they switching back to